today's gospel lesson, we have really two healing stories kind of intertwined. We start with the story of Jairus' daughter, that leader of the synagogue who came to Jesus, fell at his feet, and begged him repeatedly to heal his daughter, for she was dying. And as Jesus agreed to go and was indeed on his way, we begin to hear another healing story that takes place as this unnamed woman who had been suffering for 12 long years touches Jesus and receives healing. These stories are intertwined because Jesus pauses in the middle of responding to this great need of Jairus, the dying of his young daughter, 12-year-old girl. And he takes the time to talk to this woman. And during that time, the report comes back from Jairus' house that indeed his daughter had died. In many respects, these two women, I'm going to refer to this 12-year-old as a woman as well, these two women could not have been more different. In many respects, they could not have been more different. The woman who was suffering from a hemorrhage had been suffering for 12 long years. The young girl was only 12 years old. The woman suffering from a hemorrhage was poor, having spent all of her money on the doctors, and yet the scriptures tell us she was no better, in fact, was getting worse. Jairus' daughter, I wonder why that wasn't perfect for me. Jairus was one of the leaders of the synagogue. I knew his daughter wasn't. And was probably well off. You see, the woman had spent all of her money on these doctors and she was poor. Jairus was probably comfortable, if not well off. The woman with the hemorrhage felt that she had to sneak up on Jesus. She wasn't willing to confront him. She knew her place, if you will, in society, and had to kind of sneak around and just barely touch the cloak of Jesus. The woman with the hemorrhage was afraid to confront, where Jairus came and boldly presented himself before Jesus and fell at his feet and begged him. It says repeatedly. Begged him repeatedly to heal his daughter. The woman with the hemorrhage had what would be called a chronic disease, one that would not go away. Jairus' daughter had what would be called an acute disease, one with a quick onset and normally one that only lasts for a specific amount of time. Of course, she died from it, but again, acute versus chronic. The woman with the hemorrhage was not likely near death, having suffered with it for 12 years already. Jairus' daughter was in critical condition and was at death's doorstep. Two very different situations, very different things going on in their lives, and yet both in need of the healing touch of Jesus. And I would say they shared one other thing in common. Under Jewish law, these women had this one thing in common. They were both what would be considered untouchable. Untouchable. According to Leviticus 15, the woman with the hemorrhage was unclean, and anyone who touched her, or who she touched, would also be unclean. Now, that doesn't mean much to us today. When we think of unclean, we think we need to get the vacuum cleaner out, or we need to get the Windex and do the windows or something, or wash our hands. But that's not what we're talking about when we're talking about unclean in the society in which Jesus walked this earth. When you were unclean, it meant you could not have any contact with society. You couldn't touch anybody. You couldn't be around people because they would become unclean. If you were unclean, you couldn't participate in the normal societal events, parties and what have you. You couldn't go to synagogue. You couldn't worship. You were outside of the pale of God's reach because you could not reach toward God. Now, when I speak of them having that same thing, according to Numbers 19, I'm kind of stretching it just a little bit here to make my point, because the young girl, although she was sick and may have some disease that made her unclean, we're not clear on that. But after she had died, when she was no longer that little girl but a corpse, she was definitely unclean. And according to Numbers 19, you cannot touch a dead body without becoming unclean. Again, having to wait a certain period of time before you can interact with society again, before you can go and worship. Those labels of unclean, although I believe in the Old Testament were used to keep people safe from diseases that could be transmitted from dead bodies and from those who had bleeding disorders and things like that, although I believe they were intended to be a safeguard, they also had the result of Jesus' day of pushing people away from God, pushing people away from society, keeping people isolated and categorized in ways that didn't allow them to connect, to be loved. The gospel story this morning, I wrote in my notes, may have many messages for us, and I'd like to change that. It does have many messages for us. I find every time I read Scripture, the same stories over and over again, they mean something different to me depending on what I've gone through perhaps, or what the world is going through, or whatever paradigm or perspective I'm looking from, they seem to glitter and shine and show another angle, another facet to me. Today, the message for me out of this text, as I wrestled with it this week, is the message that God's love through Christ is for those who the world calls untouchable. It's about God touching the untouchable, the unclean, the unloved, the marginalized, those pushed off to the sides, those whom respectable people wouldn't deal with, wouldn't be with, wouldn't hang out with. We have many stories of Jesus doing just that, being persecuted by his own religion, the religious leaders of the day, people like Jairus, who were leaders of the synagogue, because he hung out with those untouchables. The prostitutes and the sinners, the lepers, the unclean. But it's bigger than that for me. In a sense, the world became untouchable to a righteous and holy God when we fell into sin. In a sense, the story of the Garden of Eden, the story of the fall, is the story of us being disconnected from God in a way that we were no longer touchable, at least directly, by God. We used to walk in the cool of the evening in the garden with Adam and Eve. We no longer could have that kind of relationship because a holy and righteous God cannot be in the presence of sin without destroying it. For our own protection, if you will, God had to isolate us from Him, in a sense. And yet, Paul tells us in Romans 5:8 that it was while we were in this state of untouchableness, that's even a word, Christ came to die for us so that we might be saved, so that we might be made clean, so that we might be touchable once again. And Paul exclaims boldly that this is proof of God's love for us. That while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. That we might be touched by God. That we might know the love that He has for us. And the Scriptures are clear that it doesn't matter how bad our sin was. Look who wrote this, Paul. What was his sin? Who knows what Paul's sin was? He was a Jew of all Jews. He was righteous according to the letter of the law, according to the letter of